Go.
Awesome. So I hope the breakouts went well. Give you a little taste of what it's like to try and build some questions or start to think about a conversation off of not a lot of information. So really leaning into that under-prepare rather than over-prepare. I want to talk a little bit about putting science in context. This is actually something that Alice and I talked about a little bit over the break, but that is part of the talk as well, which is how do we put science in its proper context, have interesting, accessible, but also not superficial conversation about science topics meant for a lay audience, or at least an audience that isn't filled with specialists who already know this stuff already. So I want to start with something my old high school English teacher used to say to us all the time in English class, which is, so what? Why do I care? Anytime someone would say something, even if it was super insightful or felt like super profound, she would always follow it up with, okay, so what? Why do I care? And it helped us think about why it mattered. Maybe it was just cool, and maybe it was just fascinating, but at least it made us think about whether it was just funny or just fascinating, or whether it actually had an implication somewhere else that meant that it shifted a thought, or that it was something that impacted something else. So it's something I've taken on board for a long time, since high school English class, which was very long ago. I often think about the so what, why do I care question when I'm thinking about constructing an interview, but also when I'm trying to explain something technical to someone, which, even though I'm not a scientist, I often find myself in that position in my day-to-day job as a programmer and a technical product manager. Be context hungry. Science in general tends to be thought of as a binary subject. Something is either a fact, it either is or it isn't. That's kind of the stereotype. But everyone close to STEM subjects knows that this is almost never actually the case. Things aren't simply one way or the other. That's what makes science topics so interesting. They're complicated and confusing and messy. And of course, society is also confusing and complicated and messy because people are messy. And when you combine the two together and mash them up, you get a lot of complexity, you get a lot of messiness, and you get a lot of relationships. And by being context hungry and asking for more context rather than drilling down to strip away the context, in particular for lay people, you make the science meaningful. We have a habit in science of stripping down all the variables. We just want to look at this one thing and trying to tease out correlation versus causation, right? We're trained to just strip it down, control for things, control for all this messiness until we get something clean and neat and tidy. But what's more interesting to lay people is how that thing acts or how that thing responds when you put all that mess and context back in. What's the impact? Why do I care? It's sort of back to that so what question, but a lot of it is around reminding yourself that when you're talking to a more general audience, it's not about stripping away the context, or at least if you need to do that to unpack the topic, at some point you got to put that context back in and talk about it. It's super, super important not to hide from the context or sweep the context away. Think about what your goal is, and in particular, when we talk about complexity. When you add complexity and start talking about the messiness and the difficulty of all of science interacting with the real world, you get a lot of complexity, which can make people really thoughtful, but it also makes actions harder to understand and unpick. If you layer on the real world, then you're probably not going to get direct action taken. If you want a direct action, if that's your goal, then you do need to keep your message simple so that people can tie a direct line from the thing you're saying to the next action they need to take. But you also have to understand that that's the spin you're putting on it and make your peace with that spin. That's politics, and science has a lot of politics in it. And anytime we're talking about wanting someone to take an action, you're inherently talking about politics. our podcast, we don't ask people to take a lot of immediate actions. We're more interested in digging into that really messy complexity, unpacking as much of it as we can, seeing it from all different angles, in particular, the angles we don't normally think about it from, or that at least our audience probably doesn't think about it from, and leaving more thoughtful than we came. If we think about something like global warming, there's a lot of lefty people will have an instant action and want to just take an immediate position on global warming and the things we need to do to make that change. It's not that we disagree, it's just that there's a lot more things we need to unpack there, and there's impacts that those actions will have on a lot of people. When you move away from coal, when you move away from oil, there's industries and people's livelihoods that count on that stuff, and those people are all impacted. We should probably all stop flying around the world, but there's a massive travel industry that, as we can see in coronavirus, has been massively impacted. These are real people. These things have real impacts. That doesn't mean potentially those aren't the right things to do. It just means we need to be aware of all of the angles. And that's just part of being intersection aware. So don't just think about the narrow range of what the line is or what your goal is. Also think about the way that it's perceived and understood by a bunch of different people on different sides of this. And by different sides, it doesn't mean you have to think about what the most Republican or Democrat of Democrat. It's not that kind of side. It's somebody who's just going to feel the impacts of this thing. I was reading a book that I'm interviewing on in a bit, where it talks about in areas of the third world, when we build a factory, quite often in exchange for that, they have to protect an area of land, especially if they've destroyed some forest in order to build their extraction factory, like mining. Sounds great, doesn't it? You build a mine, you get the goods, and you also protect a bunch of the forest or the land in that area and preserve it. But what happens to the subsistence villages around that forest who now lose access to that protected area and no longer can do what they've been doing for generations and generations, which is live off that land? That's a very real impact that is happening today in parts of the world where we think we've done a great job by preserving some land, but actually we've just booted a bunch of people off land that has been in their village for generations that they've been able to count on, and not given them anything to turn to. They're just stripped of that land and can't use it anymore. It's also really important to interrogate your own assumptions and interrogate assumptions in general. This is something I use at work, but also in the podcast. I try and spot assumptions, in particular hidden assumptions that underlie ideas or approaches or points of view, and I want to question them. It doesn't always mean they're wrong. It just means that I want to make sure we're talking about them fully and aware of the assumptions that we're making. The other thing I think that's really important is balancing idealism and pragmatism. This is, I find, really, really difficult for a lot of science people, because scientists, in my experience, when it comes to politics or how that science can be used or should be used in the world, they tend to be really idealistic. This is a great thing. We should use it all the time and everywhere. And that's great. We need idealism, but we also need pragmatism. We need to understand that those actions have other types of fallout, and there is no action we can ever take that is 100% win for everybody. It just isn't going to happen. These two things tend to pull against each other, and so we need to remember that we have to balance those two things and always come to a general conversation, in particular when there's an audience, of keeping track of that, because probably someone in that audience is going to be negatively impacted by the thing you're proposing. So it's always really important to think about both. At its heart, an interview is nothing but a good conversation that you are listening to. It's a good conversation that somebody plans to have. So the next thing we're going to talk about is just how to have a better conversation with people. This is practical advice that you can do in your day-to-day life, and I highly recommend using this and actually practicing this, even if you don't have any intention of starting a podcast or interviewing people or even being interviewed, because it can improve the quality of your conversations just generally. And a good conversation is such a joy that there's no downside in knowing how to have better conversations more frequently. So the first really important thing is listen to understand. Most of us don't tend to listen to really understand what the other person means and intends and is saying. We listen to reply. We're waiting patiently for our turn to say something. I try very hard to always come from a point of listen to understand. This has really been valuable for me as a podcaster. It's been valuable for me at work, and it's been valuable for me in my personal life. In particular, in podcasting, when you're constructing an interview, when you're trying to kind of look at a list of topics and figure out where you're going to go next, there is a piece of your attention that you need to give to that. What's next? Where are we going to go after this? But it's not as much as you think it needs to be. You should be 90% actually listening and 10% looking for the next thing to say. And if you're not constructing an interview, you really should be listening 100% of the time if you can at all. As with before, when we were talking about interrogating assumptions, don't assume you know the answer. In particular, when you're constructing an interview, but as soon as your brain assumes you know what someone's going to say next, we tend to stop listening. We tend to just then start planning how we're going to counter that point or how we're going to pivot off that point. So it's really important to try so hard not to assume that you know what someone's going to say, because a lot of the time you don't. And it's so easy to miss the nuance, and a lot of important information is buried in nuance. Ask open-ended questions, and if you haven't been asked an open-ended question, expand more than just a yes or a no. Obviously, if you're in a legal situation, that's not the most advisable thing to say, but if you're just having a general conversation, even if someone hasn't asked the most open-ended question, that doesn't mean you can't expand a little bit on what is maybe potentially answered by a straight yes or no. Know when to lead. A conversation, we often talk about leading the witness or leading a conversation as being bad, but leading can tell people where your interest is. And people who are interested in having a good conversation will quite often pick up that lead and start to move in that direction. So don't be afraid of offering out a lead or putting forward where you're interested in going next and putting it out there. Most people will pick that up and run with it, because most people are also interested in having a good conversation, and they tend to be in it when they're there. I like to think of the Goldilocks length. Most people talk too much. There's a few people who talk too little, but most people tend to talk too much. There is a just right, sort of the Goldilocks limit, but when in doubt, especially when you're doing this in your real life, in order to practice listening, try to speak less. I do this in work meetings. I actually have a little cue card or a little Post-it note that sometimes when it's a particularly difficult conversation that's happening, I'll actually put a little Post-it note somewhere where someone else can't see it that just says talk less. And it's just to remind me that I should be listening more than I'm talking. And it's a really good reminder. This one is so important and took me a long time to learn. And in my personal life, sometimes I still struggle with it, but I think when podcasting, I do it better. And this is go with the flow. Don't try and circle back to something that you really wanted to talk about because you're working too hard at constructing the next thing. We've all listened to a conversation before where it feels like it bounces around in really random places. It's okay to let a thought enter your brain and then let it leave. You don't have to talk about everything. You don't have to say every thought in your head. A good conversation has a flow. It feels like it's always moving forward. It doesn't circle back on itself. It doesn't get lost in a roundabout, going round and round and round the same thing over and over again. It tries to move forward and it tries to transform. You want to share experience. It's great to share pieces of yourself, but this can very easily go into one-upmanship or making assumptions that you know somebody else's experience. Sharing experience is really important, but I think we've all had that conversation where as soon as we share a personal experience, you feel like the other person talking is like, okay, but then this happened to me and that sounds way better, or that sounds way worse. There's a member of my extended family who's kind of famous for having these conversations, and I figured this out as a teenager. And I used to play a game where I would try and come up every time they went up to me with a more fantastical story to tell that was a complete lie. But I was just seeing how crazy, like how many times would they one up me as I got more and more ridiculous. I never won. They always beat me. So we've all been in that conversation. We all know what it's like, but it tends to be something we do unintentionally as we're trying to understand each other. We're also trying to insert ourselves into the experience. Just let someone talk about the experience, try to understand it, but don't one up them and don't put yourself there. Reduce repetition. This is the one I struggle with more than anything else on this list. I am still learning this. We repeat ourselves a lot, and sometimes there's a good reason in workplace conversations when you're trying to get everyone on the same page and make sure everyone's going in the same direction. But in a good conversation, you want to try and reduce repetition as much as you can. Super important, hard to do, super hard to do. Be a mathematician. State your assumptions up front. I live with a mathematician, a research mathematician, and this is something that I have learned just since getting close with this person, is a mathematician's tendency to state all their assumptions about the universe that they're creating as part of this discussion up front. It sounds really pedantic, and sometimes it can feel really pedantic, but it's amazing how many short-circuited conversations or misunderstandings happen because of misaligned assumptions. So it can be incredibly useful to just lay those out on the table at the beginning and work from that shared understanding of the universe rather than try and figure out what the universe looks like later. Be mindful of weeds versus wildflowers. What does this mean? We are often told to stay out of the weeds. Those details don't matter. They're not important. And a lot of the time they're not. If you're telling a story about having been to a particular place or talked to a particular person that I've never met, the date, the precise date probably doesn't matter. The person's name probably doesn't matter. It's a detail that doesn't really matter to the core of the story. So let those details go. Don't fret over them. Don't spend too much time trying to remember them. I don't know if the person's name is Tom or Ted. Don't care if you make up the name just as something to go on. Doesn't matter to me. But there are wildflowers out there and interesting places to diverge to off the path that you were on. And this is really valuable from a podcast perspective because I don't want a guest to get distracted by weeds that aren't interesting. But if they bring something up that was not on my outline, that is unexpected, but that pings my interest, I'm absolutely happy to go off the path and have a look and see what's over there and figure out if it's something interesting or beautiful, because quite often it is. So don't hyper-focus on a particular direction. Be aware of the weeds that you don't need to get into, but where there might be wildflowers off the path. This one's specific for sciencey people and technical people. We need to be careful to avoid weaponizing intellectualism. We do this a lot. We tend to want, especially when we feel under pressure or when we feel attacked, we tend to instantly lean on jargon and lean on the things that we do know, and we tend to weaponize that as a point of defense. Do the best you can to try not to do that and be open. It's really damaging for you and for science in general to feel like a weapon rather than something that's open and shared with everybody. And it's so easy to do because science can be extremely opaque. There's a lot of jargon, there's a lot of technical terms, there's a lot of detail there that a bunch of people don't know. So it's so easy to fall on this and try really hard to avoid it. This one's so simple. Say you don't know when you don't know. We often will speculate or put forth an opinion when we don't actually know. I try really hard to just say, you know what? I don't actually know. I'm not sure how to comment on that. I don't know that I have an opinion on that. And that often opens up someone else who does know, or pulls in someone else who might be listening, but less likely to contribute, who does have something to say about that topic. Ask stupid questions. I have made a full career out of asking stupid questions because there are no stupid questions. There is someone out there who also doesn't understand. And so I never worry about asking any question ever. I just ask it. I'm that person. And I rarely have any problems with people telling me my questions are stupid or reacting to me like my questions are stupid. I just ask lots of questions, and I ask them enthusiastically with an interest to learn the answer. If I don't actually care about the answer, I won't ask the question. That's a boring question, not a stupid question. Unpack things, go a little bit deeper into something. I ask guests to do this all the time. Sometimes I just put a topic in front of them and say, hey, can you unpack this a little bit for us? Just fold it open into a level you wouldn't normally go and start to pull some pieces out of it that make up that thing and talk about those pieces. Here's an interesting thing. We use mouse models here. Why do we use mouse models? Well, that's interesting because of these reasons. Mouse models are good in this particular way. What are the other types of models we could use? Here's the other types of models and why we don't use them. Here's why they're not good in these particular situations. That's actually kind of an interesting conversation and will teach people passively a lot about where models are useful and where they aren't, what their limitations are, what their benefits are, really quickly, is just by talking about each one, what it's good for, what it's not good for. Let's talk about nerves. I know this comes up a lot whenever we talk about doing podcasts or talking to people. And there's some really simple tips for beating nerves. And they're all scary. The first is talk and listen to strangers. Obviously, don't talk to somebody who's not interested in talking to you, but be open to talking to strangers. Part of what I have to do as a podcaster is I have to strike up an interesting conversation with someone I have literally just met and never spoken to before. And that can be extremely nerve-wracking if you're not well practiced in it. And so it's important to practice. If this is something you're interested in doing, then there is absolutely no better tip than I can give you than to start talking to strangers and to start having interesting conversations with strangers, because that's effectively what I do when I create an episode of the podcast. Is I call someone I've never talked to before after I've emailed them twice, and we have an interesting conversation that lasts somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour and a half. And then I never talk to them again. So it's an important skill to get if that's what you want to do or if you're interested in that. There's a whole bunch of other great applications when you learn to get comfortable talking to strangers, but in particular with podcasting, it's really important. And when you're talking to strangers, try and avoid small talk, or at least use it to hook into something in more detail. So once you get a little more chill, striking up a conversation with strangers, try and talk to them about more in-depth things, not necessarily just the weather or some basic small talk. Actually dig into something, find out what they do, find out what some more detail about why they decided to take that job. There's a lot of interesting stuff that a lot of people have to say, and it's great practice at impromptu speaking. Networking events are really great tools for this. This is actually how I learned to get comfortable talking to strangers. I started attending network events in my area, in my particular area of tech, and then I slowly started to expand out to just general networking events. And at a networking event, the whole point is you walk up to a group of people you don't know, you introduce yourself, and you ask them questions and start to get to know them a little bit. It's just really good practice. From the standpoint of impromptu speaking, I'm actually going to recommend Toastmasters table topics. Not that you actually have to join Toastmasters. You totally can if you want, and there's a good group in your area. But have a look at the table topics concept of Toastmasters. And if there's a group of friends that you have, just create a table topics group that you do every once in a while, or maybe it's something that the group here can get going. It just gets you practiced at talking extemporaneously about things that you couldn't prepare for, and that can be super useful. So those are my sort of top tips for fighting nerves, but mostly it's about practice. Almost anything can become normal if you do it enough. I proved this to myself when I was in university by deciding that I wanted to do art modeling because I didn't believe that I would be able to be comfortable sitting nude in front of people and being sketched. Turns out, took 10 minutes. 10 minutes was all it took for me to stop caring how naked I was. I wasn't going to get any nakeder, and they weren't going to look at me any closer. So it just sort of then became normal. And I know that sounds weird, but that's sort of how it worked out. And I did art modeling. I did a lot of art modeling at that point in my life because I actually found it really meditative. It was not something I expected to happen, but it really proved to me that practice and an experience of a thing can make it more normal. There's good ways and bad ways that can be bent, but you can use it to get not nervous about doing something that initially makes you nervous. All right, so our second breakout, we might need to make this one a little bit faster. I don't know if maybe you guys want to went a little bit long. So the plan was to break into the same groups of 3, and then people can do 5-minute interviews based on the questions you built before. And everybody in that group should get a chance to interview, be the interviewee, and be the audience, and then a couple of minutes at the end to possibly give feedback to each other based on that experience.
I just want to say a really big thank you to Rachelle for coming over and giving us all of this wonderful information. James will post in the chat the feedback exit poll. Please, please, please fill it out before you leave. We'll also post it in Slack. And other than that, I'm gonna let Rachelle take all the questions. But thank you everyone for being here and for a wonderful workshop.
So you had mentioned, so this is all really interesting, thanks. You had mentioned that the ad thing was like a decision that was made early on. Was the tone sort of decided early on, like this is how we're gonna be, or was it something that developed? And like, what is your advice for people who like, should we think about those things beforehand? Should we just let things progress naturally? Like,
I think it's both. The tone of the show has not shifted a lot over the decade that the show has existed. It has shifted a little bit, but not a ton. I think it probably started out a little bit more formally. I know when I first started interviewing, I was more formal. I think mostly because I was nervous. I was like, I'm interviewing a scientist. Oh no, I'm not a scientist. I must be very formal and put together and sound very smart. And after having done this for now 10 years, I'm much more like, yeah, I'm just going to have a coffee with you and let's have a talk about the work you do. Let's have a talk about the book. So our tone hasn't shifted too much. And I think it's got a lot to do with the audience you're trying to find. And also the type of podcast you want to put together. There's a lot of different types of work come with different types of podcasts. If you want a more formal tone, then you probably need to think more carefully and do a different type of preparation, as well as, depending on who you are, have a different kind of approach or voice. And that sort of adopting that persona can take a little bit of time. As much as I don't want to say I have a podcasting persona, I totally have a podcasting persona. And you would only need to talk to the other person who lives in my house to know that I have a podcast voice. And that is just something that has developed over time. When I'm podcasting, when I'm interviewing somebody, I'm in that zone and I'm in that frame of mind. And it's not a job, but it's a little bit of a job. And there's a bit of a persona that I put on in order to do that well. So it also depends on who you want to be. And it's easier to be closer to yourself than farther away. So if you tend to be a bit more of a formal person and you're more comfortable with that kind of presentation, that's great. That will appeal to a different audience though. If you're somebody who is very quick and clever, who's great with the goofs, who's always got something funny to say and you get a lot of laughs, you can totally lean into that. A lot of people really love that in their podcasts. It's not my thing. I'm terrible at it. I'm just not funny. So I it's not something I would ever try to do because I'm just not that person.
So the question is, do you have advice for how interviewees can avoid situations where the podcast organizer pulls out sound bites that make the interview seem more partisan or controversial than you think is necessary and don't really reflect the perspective that you were trying to get across?
It's difficult to avoid that once you've agreed to be on the podcast and agreed to give the interview. You don't really get a say on how that's used. So that's more about the homework up front than it is about anything you can do after the fact. It's very, very difficult to fix that problem later. It's not a thing that's easily fixed in post. As someone with a podcast, every once in a while, we get a guest who requests or asks or sometimes tries to demand the final say of the edit before it goes live. No journalist, no podcast is ever going to give you that right unless you are a government official or you're having some kind of interview with somebody where there is a critical piece of secrecy that needs to happen. So as an example, I was working for a little while to try and get an interview with somebody who works in the field of ink chemistry that is used on currency. And that person, in order to be able to get that interview, I was going to have to allow them to listen to the final edit before we put it live, just to make sure that we weren't releasing anything that was going to cause problems with counterfeiting. Totally makes sense. We would have been willing to do that in that situation, but that is an extremely exceptional situation. And the parameters of what they could say no to was very, very clear when we were discussing whether or not that interview would go forward. But if someone just says, I'm not going to be on your show unless I get a chance to approve the final edit, then my answer is, then I guess you aren't going to be on our show. So to some extent, it's about understanding the podcast before you say yes and knowing what they tend to do, knowing what type of show it is, and talking to them ahead of time. If it's a fear, if it's something you're concerned about, put it out there and say, hey, this is a thing I'm worried about because it's a thing that happens in my field. So how do I know that you guys aren't going to do that? What's your policy towards this kind of thing? What kind of thing are you looking to use my expertise for specifically in the podcast you're building? Generally speaking, if it's a conversational one, they tend to be light touch edit anyway. That's actually one of the benefits of running a podcast like ours, which is about capturing a conversation. We have an editor, but we do not do a heavy edit on the show. We are editing for poor sound. We are editing for heavy repetition. So if someone's been really repetitive, we might pull some repetitive sections out just to make things a little bit tighter. And if someone's got a lot of ums or ahs or some vocal tics that can be a little bit frustrating to listen to, we might pull some of those back as well. But by and large, we don't have the time nor the desire to heavily edit. That's one of the benefits of us doing the show. And for our guests, it's one of the things that they can count on when they come to us is we're not interested in spending the time to do a heavy edit. If we can literally just trim the front and trim the end and everything else is fine, we're happy with that. So it really depends on the podcast, and it's definitely not something you can fix after the fact. You sort of have to go in having some sense of what it's going to be like. How time intensive is running a podcast? That's a good question. Anytime you're creating content for the internet on any kind of a schedule, there is a treadmill grind. So if that's the thing you're going to do, whether it's a blog, a podcast, video, be prepared and think about the time you're willing to commit, because that will impact your schedule. There is a grind there. There is a repetition. The content treadmill never stops. It's as soon as you get one done and you put it out there, you get like a, great, that one's done. And then you start again. The to-do list just resets and it begins again. So there is a certain amount of that. Insofar as how time intensive it is, it depends a lot on the format you choose. If you are trying to create a heavily produced kind of storytelling experience, you're going to spend a lot more time than our team spends, because you're going to need to spend a lot more time doing the edit and re-listening to the edit, recutting it, and finding and sculpting that story. That can be incredibly time intensive. The way the format we chose and the way we run our podcast, because we're all volunteers, is to try and limit the amount of time we have to spend on it, because it can be very time intensive. So I read books really fast. I'm a fast reader. I can read a 300-page book in like 4 hours. So I know how long it's going to take me to do the prep, which is read the book. And because I've got a lot of practice and a lot of experience, I know I can prep that interview after having read that book in about an hour. So I know that to prepare for an interview, it's going to take me somewhere between 3 and 6 hours, depending on the length of the book. If it's not a book, then I will spend a little bit. I will try and like bucket the time to say I'm only going to spend the next 2 hours researching this, or the next 3 hours researching this, and then I'm going to write the interview in a couple of days, and I'm only going to spend an hour writing the interview, just to kind of keep the time sensible. And our editor, because we have a light touch edit, I think his edits take anywhere from an hour to 8 hours, depending on how much needs to be fixed. If there's a lot of background noise, if the person has a lot of vocal tics that we want to tidy up, the edit will take more time. If the guest has done a little bit of swearing and we need to remove those or bleep those out, will take a little bit of time. So it kind of depends. We used to be a weekly show, but we actually found that was too time intensive for us. So we've reduced our frequency, in particular in coronavirus times when people are a lot more overloaded. We've actually reduced down to once or twice a month, just to give people a little bit more velocity. So it depends. What else we've got? Do you need to put a podcast out every week to build a following, or can you put one out every month and still gain followers? Frequency can be whatever you want. You can still gain followers. Back in the annals of history, the practice was a podcast happened every week. That was the kind of established norm of podcasting when there weren't literally millions of podcasts in the world. Everybody has too many podcasts to listen to. So actually putting content out less frequently can be a selling point for your podcast potentially, in particular for an audience that may already be overloaded. And then it doesn't feel like such a huge time commitment. It's also a benefit of a podcast that doesn't require you to have listened to everything in the catalog to be caught up. Obviously, if you're listening to something that's really story intensive or that has a lot of interconnected narrative or interconnected ideas, then it's a lot more of a mountain to climb, and it feels like a lot more time commitment from a listener's perspective. Whereas our podcast, most of our listeners don't listen to every single episode, and that's cool. A lot of them will go through the back catalog or look at the feed, pick the things that look interesting to them and listen to those. That's 100% cool. So it just sort of depends. And like you need to push to a week schedule that you can't sustain. It's better to find something that is sustainable than to try and grab a lot of listeners at once. Are you able to make money from a podcast? You can. It is difficult to get to that point, especially from a science podcast. In general, a lot of the science podcasts that are getting enough listeners to make money are heavily produced, so they're more time intensive, or they're run by people who are very funny. We have a listener supported podcast, but most of us don't really make any money. The listeners pay effectively for the maintenance and upkeep of the show. They pay for our bandwidth, they pay for our technology so that we can keep things going. And we pay our editor a little bit of money because editing is a thankless job and he never gets to be on camera, but we can't do it without him. So we pay him a little bit to make sure that he gets something out of it as well. And so you can make money, but I wouldn't say you should go into podcasting necessarily with that goal in mind, in particular in a science topic. You might get there. But if you go with that topic, if you go with that goal in mind, then it's going to bend everything you do to just chase an audience rather than trying to create something that's interesting or new or niche or different. One of the benefits of podcasting is it's very niche, and there's a topic out there or a podcast for everybody's interest. If you haven't found a podcast you like yet, you just haven't found it yet. It's out there, you just haven't found it. And that's one of the benefits of podcasting. So you can. It's very time consuming. And also if you are selling ads, you have to spend a bunch of more time selling ads and managing the people who buy your ads. There's advertiser aftercare. If you've ever worked in the marketing industry, which I have, there's a whole bunch of other work that takes place as soon as you start selling something, which then means you're sort of have two jobs. You're selling a thing, but you're also trying to create a thing. And it's very easy to spend too much time selling the thing and not enough time making the thing. So, are there any questions that you absolutely need to ask guests? Well, there's a couple of, this probably isn't quite what you meant, but there are some things that I always ask guests. So we always do a sound check at the beginning, and I do a quick recording of a very brief nothing conversation with the guests in order to check our sound levels, make sure the sound is okay, make sure our relative sound is cool. And if you just ask people, say something, then people kind of stutter and like, they can't think of anything. So I always ask them a question that almost nobody has difficulty answering, which is, what did you have for breakfast today? And I have recordings of everybody that I've ever interviewed and what they've had for breakfast. Or if they didn't have breakfast that day, a conversation about, is that normal? Do you not usually have breakfast? I just launch into a conversation about whatever breakfast they had or didn't have in order to do the sound check. So a weird answer to that question is have something prepared to kind of get people going that they for sure will have an answer to without having to think about. And a good one is, what did you have for lunch? What did you have for breakfast? And then just launch that into something. The other thing I do at the beginning of an interview is I generally have what I think of as general potentially throwaway questions, like warm-up questions that we're not necessarily going to use in the final cut, but we may use if they're interesting enough. But they're good warm-ups for the person I'm interviewing. And quite often this is, what got you into this area? What interested you in writing this book? Where did the idea for this book come from? Something like that. Quite often we end up cutting that and not using that and just jumping right into a later part of the interview, but it's a good warm-up. It's like a little softball question that gets people going. Other than that, there's not really something that I absolutely need to ask guests. Those are really the only things that sort of everybody gets asked. Everyone else gets something unique to them. Will there be a special breakfast episode coming then? Oh man, that would be great. I now sometimes have the conversation with them so sometimes part of the breakfast conversation is now talking about the interesting things I know from having talked to many scientists about what they do or do not eat for breakfast. And that's now become sometimes part of the conversation, which is really interesting. I really should like mash them up all together. I just haven't got permission to share everybody's breakfast preferences with the world. So I'd have to send a lot of emails to get that consent, which would probably be a lot of work. How do you screen guests before you have them on your podcast? Great question. We don't do a lot of heavy screening, and sometimes that means we do interviews that we end up not using, and that's okay. There's been not a lot, but a small number of interviews that just went so badly that we're like, yeah, we're not going to use that. We try and find people who we don't worry too much about whether the person is good on camera. That's not what we're interested in. We're trying to find people who seem to have something interesting to say and who aren't just tourists in an area. So there's a lot of writers out there who specialize in writing pop science, but they're sort of like a tourist of an area, and then they go on to a completely different area. If we interview journalists writing pop science, we want to interview a journalist with a strong beat. So like Ed Young has a really strong beat. Rose Eveleth has a really strong beat. There's certain people who have a like area of science that they have reported on for a really long time. They know the area inside, outside, back and forth. You know that's going to be a good conversation with a journalist. But if it's a writer who's just kind of done it all, it's really difficult to have a good conversation with them because they tend to not retain a lot of the information. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a good general rule. We also tend to shy away from people who are selling things other than the book, obviously. If we're talking about the book, then we're acknowledging that they're selling a book. But in particular, we haven't done a ton of shows on food and nutrition because it is very difficult to find anyone who can talk about this field without the bias of having something to sell. They're selling a diet plan, they're selling there's so much selling happening in that field. It's very, very difficult to find someone who's not selling something. And that's not the type of interview we want to do. So we try and screen those people out as much as possible because we're not looking for a promotional interview. So we do as much research as we can up front to try and keep the number of dud interviews down. And we're generally pretty successful at that. We tend to request interviews more often than we take pitches for interviews. We could probably do more interviews more frequently if we took more pitches, but we actually tend to ignore most of the pitches and follow our own interest and do our own research for people. And that I think also helps us because we're not just taking PR pitches, we're actually reaching out to people and say, hey, your topic looks interesting. You want to talk to us about it? And most of the time people say yes. What keeps you doing this podcast for so many years? Oh gosh, I don't know. Honestly, it's really, really cool to read a book, a science book, and then get a chance to talk to the author of it for like an hour and a half about the thing you read. That's really cool and really interesting. And I've had so many great conversations with people that I never would have ever talked to otherwise. And for me, that's really cool. And I'm happy to do it for that alone because I find that really interesting. And it's such a great way to engage with a book. It's changed the way I read nonfiction. I read every nonfiction book and interact with the book like I'm going to conduct an interview on it, even though I may not. And it's changed the way I think about science and the way I talk to other people about science. Yeah, I think it's mostly just I get a chance to talk to really interesting people that I wouldn't get to otherwise, and that's cool. So thanks, everybody. It was really great to be invited. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks for sticking out for a little one. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This was great fun.